thank you all for having me so much. Obviously, my voice is a little hoarse, which in retrospect was maybe not the best choice. But the what we're going to talk about today is a little bit just feeding off of that video, which is nice. The regenerative practices on limited acres, the sort of practices that we utilize on our small farm in central Kentucky, which is in total, our production area is 1 acre, right? We really can't go much beyond that on our particular farm and in a lot of small farms in Kentucky, because all the horse farms, they want the flatland, so they get the flatland. We get the slalom courses. So we have this kind of bumpy, kind of hilly property, and it's about 1 acre in production with about a ½ acre of actual bed tops. So our beds are 4 foot wide, 18-inch pathways in between. And we use a number of different practices on our farm. You can see this is cover crop that was pushed down there, that brown stuff on the left-hand side. That's also cover crop with tomatoes planted into it, rye and vetch. Garlic out here, more cover crop. Living pathways, a lot of mulches. There's wood chip mulch here, leaf mulch there, compost mulch here. We utilize a variety of different things because that's what we have access to. But I'm going to talk about how we kind of choose to do those sorts of things, how we choose our practices. Real quick, as Jaden said, I farm with my wife, Hannah, there, and our 2 livestock right there. They'll get in the garden sometimes. They don't eat as much as I want them to, but they'll definitely stomp on some stuff. In complement to all of this is the book that I wrote, the Living Soil Handbook. This, obviously, in a 45-minute talk with 15 minutes of questions that we'll put at the end, so make sure to write them down if you have them. I can only cover so much, but this book will flesh out a lot of that. You can get it at no-tillgrowers.com. That's the best place. That supports our work. Our whole philosophy at No-Till Growers is how do we give as much information as we possibly can away for free and still make it viable for us, to be able to do it. So yeah, all of our information, all of our YouTube videos, all of our podcasts, all of that stuff, we do a lot of them. We have several different podcasts going at the moment with another one coming. We haven't announced yet, but we have more podcasts than you can, anything we talk about today, there is even more information out there that's free and accessible. So luckily I don't really have to answer this question because the video did, but what is regenerative agriculture? What am I talking about when I'm talking about regenerative agriculture on a small scale? And this isn't just a question that a lot of people have, it's a question researchers have. In 2020, there was a really interesting paper that looked at 229 different journals, and their question was what is, and I think subtext being what the heck is regenerative agriculture? Because, it's not clear. It's more about, as that video said, about those principles than it is about a definition. The idea is that the soil can regenerate itself, it can repair itself, but what is our role in that? That's essentially what, regenerative agriculture is. And what they found is they went through all these different, I think it was, 229 journal articles, and, they found a lot of themes, right? Reducing tillage, protecting or covering the soil, so a lot of mulches. I'm not going to go through each one of these, but restoring natural habitats, I think, is a really cool one. And using organic methods, using natural pest control, all of these things that we sort of just saw in that video, but just in general, we sort of associate with regenerative agriculture, and we sort of associate with sort of holistic organic agriculture. The outcomes is one of the areas that I think is more interesting in this paper, because it found that what's the goal? What are we trying to do? Right, and a lot of it makes sense, right? To increase biodiversity, to improve ecosystem health, to increase carbon sequestration, to improve animal welfare. And by and large, the practitioner websites, I would guess a No-Till Growers would be a practitioner website, right? And the journal articles largely meet up, but there are a few places that kind of stood out to me. In particular, this one right here, this focus on localism and or regionality was not as big with the practitioners as it was with the researchers and stuff. Same with the focus on small-scale systems, not as big with the actual practitioners. Relying on farm labor, including for local knowledge, which I think is amazing. 3 papers said it, none of the practitioners. And other, I don't know why that one didn't get a lot with the practitioners, but we'll see. I want to add one that I think is really important, that affecting your local community should be a goal of regenerative agriculture because it is part of agriculture, your local community, whether you engage with them or not. Quick story, a few years ago, 10, 12 years ago, I was driving home. I picked up some compost, shoveled it out of a neighbor's barn, was driving home, and I was laughing because I could see out the back of my windows in the pickup truck, and it was just, blowing into my neighbor's lawns. And I was like, my neighbors are going to hate me because their lawns are going to be killer this year, and they're going to have to mow them twice as much. And I was just laughing about that. I thought it was funny. And then I pull under our drive. We had a really long drive at the time as an older farm. And we had all these wildflowers. And I was pulling up, kind of around the wildflowers, and I noticed on both sides that it was like there was this brown streak, and a lot of the wildflowers were kind of dead and like wilted looking. And I was like, what is going on? And then I realized our neighbors had sprayed that day. And they were spraying Roundup or something. I don't know. Maybe it was, I don't remember what time of year. It must have been a Roundup at that time for Roundup Ready corn or something. And it was drift. And I think all of us probably here, more so than even where I'm from, are familiar with drift, right? You spray at the wrong time, wind picks up, and it doesn't stay there. And I had this realization in that moment that one of the interesting things about farms is that they're not containable, right? Like your deed is not going to tell you where your farming practices stay. Your barbed wire fence is definitely not going to keep it there, right? It's in the water, it's in the soil, it's in the air, it's in the food that we eat. And it also occurred to me that when you farm with life, right, like me, compost, farming with life, that's my goal. You spread life. But when you farm with death, you spread death too. And in fact, I wanted to bring this up partially because we're seeing a really tragic example of that right now in Illinois. You see 6 people dead, 37 in the hospital, 72 car pileup, because of the way that people are farming, right? You cannot contain your farming practices. What you do into your soil spreads, and it can spread positively, it can clean the water, clean the air, can add biodiversity, add biology, or it can spread negatively. Death spreads death. Right? Like if we're just trying to attack our weeds and attack our problem with tillage or whatever it is, that ends up in the air and it ends up in a very, really tragic situation in this case. But it also ends up in our food and our water, and it ends up in a tragic situation in a very slow fashion. So I'm going to get off my soapbox, but I think that's really important to think about. And I'm going to talk now about what spreading life, regenerating, looks like on a small scale when you're limited. So, what regenerative agriculture looks like at Rough Draft Farmstead. They mentioned 5 basic principles. We use 3, essentially. Actually, all 5, but we kind of squish them together. So, the basic principles that we apply starts with this one. Keep the soil covered as much as possible. Now, these are the conservation agriculture principles. These are the same principles that we just saw in that video. These are very, well-known, well-refined, but they look different based on your context. Our context, we're in Central Kentucky, Zone 6B. We have access to certain materials, and you probably have access to other materials. We don't. One of our big ones is hay. We have a lot of access to hay. We have almost no access to straw. There's just no grain production there. And if we do, it's $12 or $15 for a square bale, which just means that it's not feasible. We can't make money. We can't grow food reasonably with that kind of prices. But we can get these for $4 or $5 a bale, so that's a little bit more feasible for us. And I'm talking round square bales, not big round bales. So we keep the soil covered absolutely as much as possible. We put down mulches on basically every bed that we can. I'm experimenting more with lower mulches because for reasons I'll explain right now. We use a lot of compost, but the reason that we're pulling a little bit back from compost is we're seeing a lot of broadleaf herbicide, or persistent herbicide contamination in compost, which it would kill broadleaf plants like our tomatoes and et cetera, and also contaminate them, right? Death spreads death. It can't even be taken care of. Some of these last for 10 years or more in the soil. Some will last for multiple 3 years in a compost pile. So we have been pulling back from using those, so we've had to get really creative about the types of mulches that we're using. But we do like it when we have good access to good compost, to put 3 or 4 inches down over the soil as our mulch layer, because it's warm in the spring. It is really good weed barrier. Not a lot germinates in it because it's a very high carbon percentage, and that's great if you're not direct seeding. It's terrible if you're direct seeding. But it prevents stuff from germinating right in the surface, so we have almost no weed issues. We use a lot of, this one is kind of a partially decomposed leaf mold, essentially. We just get piles of leaves from our neighbors, and they do a lot of leaf collection in the fall, and then they put it in a giant pile for us, and I add some nitrogen. I get that to decompose, and by nitrogen, I just add like a fish emulsion, or a fish hydrolysate rather. So I buy a fish hydrolysate, and I mix that up, and then I get it into our leaf compost pile. And I get it to compost as much as I possibly can over the winter. And then in the spring, I apply that, and this is in our tomato beds that are in our tunnel. We'll use a little bit things like cardboard. I'm not as, again, it's sort of like the compost thing. I'm trying to move away from these things that could be adding different chemicals to our soil. But what we'll do in this case is we will put down cardboard, lay a little bit of compost over top just to hold it down, because wind, just not a fan of cardboard, and it will throw it at your neighbor's house. So what we do is we put down the cardboard, put down a little bit of the compost, and then we will apply a thicker layer of compost over top of that. The original layer is just to hold it down. So then we'll apply 6 or 7 inches, then you can let that decompose, and then you can just plant right into that. And by decompose, I mean maybe a few months, depending on how wet you are. Like we're here, it takes maybe 2 months in Kentucky in the spring for that to decompose enough for us to feel good about planting into it. You can technically plant into it right away. It just depends on the quality of your compost. We keep it planted as much as possible. This is the living plant roots thing, right? Sometimes our garden can look a little bit wild, and it can look like, especially with these living pathways here, clovers and, excuse me, different grasses, various grasses, whatever nature wants to throw in there as well, but we usually put in white clovers, chamomile too. We use a little bit of thyme, and basically those stay in the pathways at all times, and then we crop constantly as much as we can. If there's always, absolutely as much as possible, something growing. And we do, one of the things that I can't get back to, but we'll get back to in a minute, we have 2 different approaches to our gardens. So this right here, this area, this was taken 3 weeks ago. Sorry, I'm not trying to rub that in your faces. But basically we have 3, maybe that was 2 weeks ago, sorry. But it was, but basically we have a whole section, and I'll point this out later, that is dedicated to fast-growing crops. So that's like lettuces, onions, carrots, green onions rather. We do also our shallots and stuff in there sometimes, but then arugula, anything that's like 60 days or less, squashes. And we'll plant those in our high rotation plots, which is about half of our garden. And then in our slow rotation plots, which you can't really see, but you saw the mulch earlier, that was one. And out here, and then it kind of goes around there. There's a cover crop there. And basically that is for potatoes and that sort of stuff. So that's further away from our washing and packing area. We keep all those slower, longer season crops away. And those beds usually get like 1, maybe 2 crops per year. And they also, the fertility is primarily cover crops. That's a little bit more difficult in the high rotation plots. For those, their fertility can be things like alfalfa meal, more compost and that sort of stuff. But when we can cover crop in there, we do. Obviously, this cover crop is in our high rotation plots. And anyway, I'll show that to you again. Oh, there it is. I didn't need to do that. So yeah, this is the cover crop probably, like I said, like 2 weeks ago. So our cover crop, we'll be crimping our cover crop by mid-May, which is complicated for you all. I was talking to Jay and Seth about cover cropping here, and then it's hard to get your cover crops tall enough and mature enough to crimp them and then plant into them. So, that may require something totally different from you, maybe fallow fields or beds that you plant just to cover crop the year before that you use them. We do a lot of undersowing in the fall, but I know a lot of stuff's not going to survive for you here. So like we use crimson clover that will undersow over our brassicas, for instance, in the fall. We'll undersow that, and then that'll grow, but it will, here I would imagine it would die underneath the snow, or potentially in the freezes. But basically that grows, and that's our cover crop. And then once we're done with those brassicas, we cut our cauliflower or whatever it is. Then it just kind of grows up and it fills in that space over the winter, and then in the spring we kill it. And again, with the living pathways, this is last year, I think. So this would have been like mid-March. Some wheat in our little hedge wedges. We just absolutely as much photosynthesis as possible, right? You have this really magical chemical reaction that we get to interact with. And you should just have as much as possible on your soil. It's great for the soil, right? It's converting carbon dioxide, sunlight, and water into carbon, and it's incredible. And it's feeding your soil life. And it's, in our case, those living pathways are very much a product of where we are. I don't know how something like that would work here. I have no idea. I don't know, maybe it would take too much water for you all, or maybe it would be something that you could have early in the spring and then just let it die off while you're watering your beds. Because I don't find that they steal a ton of moisture. In fact, I find there's more moisture right there at the edges where the living covers are than there are in the beds. So something with those plant roots, just maintaining that moisture, it works for us. But we get a lot more rain than you all. So that's complicated. If it were me in your situation, I would probably in a situation where I'm not getting consistent 1 to 3 inch rainfalls in an hour, and it's washing out like things like wood chips, I would put wood chips in my pathway. I can't do that as much on our farm anymore because they just wash out. So the living pathways are also a water management element for us. For you, it's probably more about keeping the water in. For us, it's making sure the water has a way to get out when we don't want it. And that can be difficult, but the living pathways do help to utilize some of that water and then also just release it without taking soil with it. Disturbing the soil as little as possible is a complicated principle, because what is disturbance, right? For us, no-till does not mean no engagement with the soil, right? It means we get to, like I said earlier about photosynthesis, really extraordinary chemical reaction. One of the things that we can do that nature can't is that we can take plants out of our greenhouse and shove them into soil. Like we can put an immediately photosynthesizing plant into bare soil or into soil that doesn't have it right at that moment. That's a really amazing thing that we have the skill set to do. And it can't mean no disturbance ever, because this is another scenario where we're taking basically like an auger bit on a drill and going into these. I'm going a little bit into the native soil with that deep compost mulch, and we're putting our tomatoes in. And then we're going to fill all the extra space with additional plants immediately. It went from being bare, because this was a new ground. So we went from, we tarped it, like we threw a big black tarp over it, killed all the grass there, pulled the tarp off, laid down our paper mulch, I think in this case, and then our compost. And then we just drilled the plants immediately into it. And it went from being, bare to instant garden, instant photosynthesis, which I think, is a really important part about keeping it planted as much as possible, right? To get it started required some disturbance, and it required some, being out of photosynthesizing plants, but then it was immediately and really rapidly put into really big, healthy plants. And I was talking to Lyndon over here earlier about this particular tool. This is the Broad Fork, and I like how my voice cracks there. It hasn't done that in a long time. So the Broad Fork is a really interesting tool. For us, our soils are very clay heavy. Like I was telling people earlier, if we had just had our snow melt like a few days ago, and we don't get snow, that's not a thing in Kentucky, but let's pretend it is. If we just had our snow melt a few days ago, there's no chance we'd be able to farm And we wouldn't be able to do anything in our soil because it'd be mud. It'd be too wet. But because it's mostly clay, it's like very heavy soil. So what we have to do is, especially in new gardens, is use something like the Broad Fork to help break up that compaction a little bit. Now, the beauty of a tool like this is that it is not just a tool of disturbance, right? We think of that as like a negative thing to always be doing to your soil. But for us, that gets the soil prepared. It gets it better ready for photosynthesis. And the genius of a Broad Fork is it's a tool that puts itself out of work. Like, it's a tool that makes itself obsolete, because if you do it right and you do it in conjunction with plants, consistent plantings, you have less compaction. Like, the plant roots will get into those holes. The compost that you put on the surface will get into those holes, and it will slowly decompact your soil. And then after a couple of years, you'll find you don't need it on certain beds. Maybe other beds need it for longer. Just depends on how much compaction was there before. This is modern day Indonesia, right? There's a pole there, but it's pretty much looked like you can imagine. This is pretty much what it looked like for a long time, thousands of years perhaps. And there's a lot of disturbance there, but there's also an extraordinary amount of biodiversity, of photosynthesis, right? It's just, there's a lot going on there, but it may have required, in this particular instance, some amount of disturbance to get going, right? Our farm, this is the first year on the new property, required some disturbance. I had to turn these beds downhill slightly to release some of that water. This hill is like a mess. It'd be hard to explain, but I had to do this. I had to do that to other beds as well. It left these little funny triangles, which we call our hedge wedges, and they're awesome. They have like birdhouses and a lot of flowering plants right there in the middle of the garden. We now have a few more, and this situation here, we had to originally plow these fields to get them going, because this was a horse pasture, because everything in Kentucky was a horse pasture. And this is highly compacted. I mean, these were enormous horses, and that was their throughway. And there wasn't much we could do. We could wait years and let the plants do it, or we could break it up and get it photosynthesizing plants. And basically, these had cover crops for 2 years, just like to break it up. And, and a little bit of broad forking, that sort of stuff. And we're slowly getting there. But dense soils take time. And so principle number 4 here. Oh, and also this is like, while I have this open, this is our high rotation plots. We started those first. This is our wash pack station. So all of this stuff is really close to where we wash and pack it. And then our greenhouse is here. And these are our slow rotation plots. There's now 7 of them, or 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 of them. I was close. 5 of them right here. I think they're 15 beds apiece. Some of them are 16. I've expanded them here. So anyway, that's where we grow our potatoes, sweet potatoes, popcorn, winter squash. And so growing as diversely as possible, right? That's another one of the principles. You want a diversity of crops, and we do. We grow, carrot, in this picture, carrots and radishes and 2 different kinds of beets. But we grow 40, 50 different crops. In those high rotation plots, they'll see 5 different crop species in a year. And that's if it doesn't get a cover crop. If it gets a cover crop, it's getting a multi-species cover crop, 3, 4 species usually. I mean, my go-to is rye, vetch, crimson clover, and then whatever seeds I have left. Usually some lettuce, some arugula, throw that stuff in there. Doesn't hurt anything. In fact, arugula could be a good option sometimes for you all, those really fast-growing brassicas. They don't have a lot of above-ground biomass, but they do a lot below ground that's really beneficial. So grow as diversely as possible with a diversity of life-promoting inputs. We use a lot of compost, and we use a lot of different kinds of compost. I outline the 4 different types of compost in the book. But yeah, we basically try to use fertilizing composts. So that would be like richer compost from like our chickens. You'll see our chickens in a second, but basically if I have a little bit of chicken manure, I'll mix that with like some leaves and stuff and make like a really high fertility compost. And I'm gonna use that for stuff that draws a lot of nitrogen, like arugula. That's one that just loves nitrogen. So that's one that I would put down before I'd put down arugula. Nutritional compost are like really well balanced, so I may even add some rock minerals or something. And that would be something I'd want as like my main mulch or underneath of like a mediocre compost mulch. Then you have inoculating compost. So that would be like if you've ever heard of Korean natural farming, that's a good inoculating compost. Vermicompost, that's kind of on the border of fertilizing and inoculating, but lots of good microbes in there. Consider that inoculating compost. And then mulching compost are like your really mediocre composts. So that would be like, like a wood chip, a really heavily broken down wood chip, or I showed those leaves earlier. That'd be like a mulching compost. So there are different types of compost. And if you call a composter and ask them about it, they'll have no idea what you're talking about. But that's how you would ask. You'd be like, is it super high carbon? So is it going to be really mulchy? And that would be your mulching compost. Or what is it made out of? Is it made out of a lot of chicken manure? That'd be much more like a fertilizing compost because it would be high nitrogen. How we don't do a lot of, like we don't do any sort of confinement, right? Like we don't have like a confinement barn. I can draw a lot of chicken manure. I have a little thing that you can kind of see there, like a chicken tractor that sometimes collects some chicken manure on the bottom, and I can shovel it out. But what we do is we run them through our cover crops when they're young, and let the cover crop absorb that nitrogen and put it into its growth, and then we'll crimp or kill our cover crop, however we're going to do it, and then we can plant the next crop. So I don't utilize. We used to have sheep. I've done sheep, cattle, goats, everything. On our new property, it's just too small for most of those things. And I kind of enjoy backing off of some of those animals because we didn't ever have the scale to make them profitable. And therefore I didn't feel like it was ever fair to them or to us. So it didn't feel like there was always a little tension. But with the chickens, although there's always tension with the chickens because they love to get in the garden, they are really good at going in and helping to fertilize these cover crops and then letting the cover crop grow up and then putting that back into the soil. So instead of putting raw manure or whatever onto bare soil, we're putting it into a growing photosynthesizing plant and letting that plant dictate how much it needs and what it wants to do with it. And that's, we're not trying to kill cover crops with animals. I think, people talk about that sometimes, and maybe there are certain circumstances. I know the Gabe Browns maybe talked about a few where it makes sense, but I feel like when you're having an animal eat something down to the ground like that or eat it, it can be a little bit iffy. You really have to know what you're doing. So with this, we just use them as fertility. Because if we left them there long enough, yes, they would kill the cover crop, but they'd also be pretty unhealthy. So these are the principles. Keep the soil covered as much as possible. Keep the soil planted as much as possible. Disturb the soil as little as possible. And the bonus being keep it as diverse as possible, diversity of inputs. Those are the principles, but this is the most important part. Context is extraordinarily important. I don't have a picture, but the farm we moved from in 2020, really well-drained soil, really exposed. It was kind of on a ridge top, so we got a lot of wind, a lot of sunlight. So things grew a little faster, but it was also really, really hard to maintain for the wind and all those sorts of things. But the water drained out of it fairly well, so it also meant we needed more irrigation, but it meant it wasn't retaining too much water. We weren't having flood issues. Our new farm, lots of poor drainage, not as exposed, not as much wind problems, lots of poor drainage. Those farms if I just told you those farms separately, you'd be like, yeah, that sounds like they're too far away. They're 15 minutes apart, and I have to farm them totally different. Context is so incredibly critical to what you're doing. You have to evaluate your materials. Like I talked about hay and compost. Compost has become an issue for us because horse feed from oats is where you're getting a lot of those persistent herbicides into the compost system. It's passing through their system into the compost and it's not getting decomposed, right? Death spreads death. And what's happening is that's ending up on farms and farmers are losing their crops. I had a friend who had to move off of his farm because of contamination. So we do have access to compost, but lots of deciduous trees. So we have a lot of leaves. We have a lot of wood chips, and we have a lot of hay. But we don't have things like straw, which could be a great resource if doesn't have broadleaf herbicide or some other herbicide sprayed on it, which I know can be complicated. And knowing the purveyor, knowing the person that's selling it is helpful. Yeah, I mean, that there's, just what's your water, what's your moisture, all of those things. That's all of your context. And I've done videos on context. Like Jane mentioned, we have a whole YouTube page that kind of covers these things, and just hundreds of podcasts. But I want to make sure to leave enough time because there's no way to cover all of that in 15 and 45 minutes. So I want to make sure to leave time for questions. The rabbits, deer, etc. Yeah. So there's a few different approaches. I mean, fencing for rabbits is really difficult, obviously. In those situations, like if you're having really intense rabbit pressure, covering things is going to be your first line of defense. So that's like insect netting or row cover. It's not great, it's not pretty, it's not fun, but that's a good way of just breaking the cycle, breaking the habit. We kept a dog in our gardens, excuse me, for many years, and that basically remedied all the deer rabbit issues we ever had. Then when we couldn't do that anymore on a new property, because our dogs are bonkers and they just dig everything up. Our old dog was great. New dogs, they didn't learn from him. They kind of decided they wanted to dig everything up. So we have a fence up that works okay. Deer fencing it's worth investing in. It doesn't have to be expensive. It can be 2 electrical lines or 3 electrical lines separated by 4 feet. Deer, at least for us, our deer, I'm not sure if your alls are the same. I'm assuming they would be, have poor depth perception. So when they see those lines, those electrical lines, and they're hot, they'll sniff it and smell it and you bait it. They won't jump over that because they can't perceive how far away that is. You set them 4 feet apart. You have 2 lines on the front side, like towards your garden. You have 1 line on the outside. You bait both of them. So if they sniff it, it'll zap them and it'll tell them not to go away. You can get those supplies from Premier One. It's a little bit of an investment, but if those are and I'm assuming that's a significant issue here because a deer is probably like, oh, there's a lot of greenery here. So, so that would be something you'd want to invest in if you want to have a good protected garden. Or, even a small dog would be helpful. I don't know, obviously there are other predation issues for you all than there are for us, but we had a Great Pyrenees that did a wonderful job. Would occasionally sleep in a bed, but 99% of the time stayed out of the garden and just barked his head off all night. It was great. So we never had, weirdly, we just never had deer issues that way. It's one of those things that's very contextual. Like if you're up against woods, it's gonna be different than if you're kind of in an open area. I think fencing, and then for deer or for rabbits, breaking the cycle by covering and then also catching live traps. Just they don't want to come back to a place that they've been caught a bunch of times. So that's helpful. I think that's about as good as I can do on that question.
Maybe not. I can just talk. My question is you're certified organic, right?
Yep.
Do you have issues with your certifier and your sourcing of materials? I've looked into what we can do. We put an orchard in, and we have to get a land affidavit or affidavit for wood chips from our local tree trimmers and stuff. And no one was really willing to do that because they can't guarantee that the tree wasn't sprayed with something here or there. Do you have any issues with that at all?
We haven't had any. So our certifier, it may depend a little bit on your certifier how hard they're going to be about that. They've asked for some affidavits. So the question is, if you are certified organic, we're certified organic. We have to follow all the organic NOP guidelines. And the question is essentially, if you're bringing in wood chips or bringing in hay or bringing in straw, you have to get the supplier to confirm that they have not sprayed it, that it does not have residue on it. And they sign an affidavit. They basically are filling out an affidavit. For us, the certifier has never asked for an actual affidavit except for a previous land use affidavit. So that would be like a previous land use affidavit. If you want to certify your farm and the person who owned it before has not sprayed anything, you can get them to sign a previous land use affidavit, and that basically is like instant certification. You can start your certification. You don't have to wait 3 years. If they're willing to say, yeah, by law, I've not sprayed anything. So to answer your question, though, depends on the certifier, and usually for us, they just show us a text message that says they didn't spray anything. So they're not looking for like a legal binding document. But if your certifier is, that does complicate things. I mean, you'd have to explain to them that, to the person you're buying it from, that there's not going to be legal action. As far as I know, I'm not aware of a certifier going after a supplier because they suspect there was something sprayed on it, because that'd be ludicrous. Like wood chipper can't prove or not prove that. If they know for sure, you just have to ask, like, do you know if it ever happened? That's what's important. Like, do you know of it happening? Because if you do, then I can't use it. But if you don't, that's good. Yeah, it's a complicated question. Yeah. Yep.
When your winters aren't as extreme as ours, what's that window for you of I can plant to I am completely planted as much as possible to keep that close to the system? Or is there ever a period where there is, I can't do anything to I now have everything?
So are you talking about like frost-free windows, or are you talking about?
Sure, I guess, yeah, but when you kind of hit that point of, okay, we can plant to we are now completely planted, what is that kind of window?
Okay, so yeah, so the question's about like frost-free dates, essentially. Like we are frost-free from like May, really around you all. We're May 12th is what I consider it. Everybody else says it's Mother's or Derby Day, which is not always true, but it's Kentucky, you can't tell them differently. But so that would be next weekend, so it'd be about right. So I say May 12th. May 12th in 2020, we hit 24 degrees. And so a lot of people got fried in their tomatoes and stuff, getting them out. But we shoot for, like, we'll start planting about in the field in mid-March. And we just make sure we don't plant more than we have row cover for. But our fields are not frozen. Like by that point, by like February, by the end of February, like they're not frozen. Like they're pliable, they're not too wet. And that's another thing about the way that we farm. Like I mentioned, like if we'd had snow melt a few days ago, we wouldn't be able to plant. I'm talking about other people in Kentucky. Like we can plant in the middle of the winter if we want to, based on how we practice, unless it's very, very cold. But our soil's generally ready to go. Excuse me. So we can plant around March, mid-March. We can start getting the more hardy stuff out. And then our first frost of the year is usually a little bit later than yours. It's in October, usually around the 10th. Some months we don't get it till the end of October. But yeah, that's full. We're at full tilt right now. Like I leave at 5 a.m. to get back because I got to send out lists for the weekend because we got to harvest tomorrow and Friday, or Thursday and Friday. Well, Wednesday, Thursday, and Friday. Yep. Any other questions? I know people often have questions about the living pathways too. So if you have any questions about like management and that sort of stuff, yeah.
I'm wondering about your setup for no-till gardening.
Yep.
You start with grass, then you tarp it, then you garden it, then you compost.
Great question. The question is like, how do we determine how we're going to break into the soil, essentially? And we do a number of different things. Some of it depends on what kind of materials we have. Some of it depends on the quality of that soil. Like when I say that spot where the horses was compacted, I mean like you couldn't get a shovel into it. So what we'll do in that situation is we will, I'll try, if I can, mow it for like a season. Just let it get tall and mow it down and let the grass kind of break it up a little bit. And that only goes so far with that particular situation because it's so compacted. So what we'll do is we'll broad fork into it, and then we'll use what's called a rotary plow. That will basically just plow it up, and then we'll cover crop it. And then if we can, also apply a mulch in the spring. That's the best. So we'll plow it, and then we'll make our beds, and then we'll apply mulches if we can, and a cover crop, or a cover crop and then the mulch the next spring. So another thing with cover crops in our area is that they decompose really fast. because we are high organic, it's very warm, it's very moist. It's just microbial heaven. So they will decompose mulches really quickly. So cover crop mulch is rarely enough for a whole season. It's rarely sufficient for us. So oftentimes we have to supplement a little bit with some other mulch. So there's that. There's also the method I had mentioned about laying down cardboard and then compost. That works too. That would be, you can do that right over grass. I think I showed in that, maybe too much to get back there, but I think I showed in that one slide just laying it down. I don't think it's that far. Let's see. So like you can see, that's pretty much just grass there. And I lay the cardboard down, lay the compost over top of that, wait a few months, not even a few months, maybe 2 months, and then plant something shallow rooted or get deep into the native soil with like a tomato or something. But something shallow rooted, it usually gets through pretty fast. And so that's like a never till system. I don't always think that's the best approach though, because it depends. So many of your nutrients your plants are so reliant on the nutrients in the compost that if it's not a really well balanced compost, you'll get a mediocre crop. Second year, it'll be better, but that's a lot of gardens. Like a lot of gardens, in our experience with no-till, the first year's good, the second year is great. And then the third year, if you've done everything well, it'll get better, or it'll be at least the same. But yeah, the first year, especially with heavy compost applications, because the nutrient load can be so heavy, it can be a little complicated.
Do you use your mulching compost on that?
Yeah, in an ideal scenario, what we would do is we'd put down like a nutritional compost first, and then we would put a light mulching compost. So the mulching compost would be more supplementary, but the nutritional compost that's balanced, that's maybe even been tested.
That goes under the cardboard or on top?
You could put it under the cardboard. I'd put it on top of the cardboard. Yeah. Yep. And then you'd want to keep it wet because that's going to break down the cardboard. We also, I don't have a picture of it, but we also use like a mulch paper, which I like slightly better than cardboard because, I don't know, I get freaked out about cardboard sometimes, although we only use like the plain cardboards. There's been more reports of like PFAS and that sort of stuff coming up from any sort, PFAS being like a forever chemical, a fun new one that we're getting. That's good. It's going to be like asbestos of our day, is this PFAS, PFOAs. And they're essentially just chemicals that are used in, there's probably lots of us on us right now. They're repellent. They're water repellent. And sort of like the chemicals that this gentleman was talking about, they're made specifically to resist decomposition, sort of like some of those persistent herbicides. They're made specifically to resist being water soluble or being decomposed by microbes, which I don't know why anybody ever thinks that's a good idea, but I think with waterproofing it makes sense. Like you need people to, I think to some extent, but as it gets released into the environment in various ways, in one of them being it's sprayed on compost or on cardboards and also ironically compostable materials sometimes, like compostable containers. So when that stuff gets into the environment, now you have this issue of PFAS, PFOAs. And we did a video about compost that you can watch online that has more information about that. Yes?
What is nutritional compost?
So a nutritional compost would just be really well balanced. It'd be like a compost that has a lot of the nutrients that you need. Like it would be more, how do I put this? If you're missing specific things in your soil, running them through your compost first before putting them onto your soil is going to make them more bioavailable. So if you want to add, let's say like calcium, and that's something you need in your garden, you can see it in your soil test, you could run that through your compost first and put that on. That's what I think of as a nutritional compost, is one that's addressing nutritional needs in the soil through the compost. And we'll do that. We'll add like various forms of calcium. That's a good one because oftentimes we're using these for like our tomatoes and peppers that need a lot of that sort of stuff. And if you can make it more bioavailable, a lot of times people are putting these on their soil, which is great, but if you don't have a lot of biology to release that, it's a year before a lot of that's going to be available to your plants. So running it through your compost first and then getting it onto your soil is much faster way. Yep.
I have a question about the hardware when you were just talking about the water retardant.
Yeah.
Is it wax
Yeah, it's waxy.
Okay, so if don't use waxed cardboard.
Right. Yeah, like very plain, not like you want, even in organic certification, they'll allow like plain cardboards with no ink and that sort of stuff. And that's, you just want to avoid any waxy like materials. And it's usually like the food boxes, which is sad, but yeah, that's how it is. Yeah. I feel like Jaden and I'm probably going over my time at this point. But the website is no-tillgrowers.com. You can get the book there too. That's the best place to just support the work we do. But I don't begrudge people for finding it on Amazon or wherever if they need to save a few bucks. But yeah, otherwise, thank you all for coming, and it's been super fun. I look forward to Dan's talk.